Oh, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this event hosted by the UCLA YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the UCLA Department of History, the UCLA Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. Today, we welcome Professor Shay Hazkani for a discussion of his latest book, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War. I should also say how fitting it is that our conversation falls on Yom HaZikaron this year, given that the book deals so heavily with war, and even more specifically with the voices of individual soldiers. My name is Avery Wyman, and I'm a PhD student in the UCLA Department of History and the Nazarian Center's Harry C. Sigmund Graduate Fellow. Joining me for today's event are the book's author, Professor Shay Hazkani, who is Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Professor David N. Myers, the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History and the Director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy right here at UCLA. My thanks to you both for joining us today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Of course. So I just want to let the audience know that today's event will have 3 parts. So first, I'm going to invite Professor Hazkani to provide a very brief overview of Dear Palestine, how the project came to be, what the book is about, and what the most important takeaways and insight from the book are. Then Professor Hazkani, Professor Myers, and I will have a roundtable discussion about the book. We will talk about the book's reception, Professor Hazkani's works with archival censorship, and some of the most insightful historical discoveries in the book. And then to close the program, we will take questions from you, the audience, for a 10-minute Q&A. And with that, I want to turn the microphone over to you, Professor Hazkani, for a very short introduction to the book.
Thanks so much, Avery. I'm really excited to be here with you, Avery. We had some on-record and off-record conversation about Dear Palestine, and obviously with David, who has, for a decade probably now, has really been a major, mentor and worked with me in some of these ideas. And I remember his book on Simon Ravidovich coming out, and when I started my graduate studies, and that sort of the radicalism of that individual was really sort of helping for me in framing some of the questions that I ask. So, Dear Palestine, a social history of the 48 war, that's the title we've chosen. And it is a history of the war. It's absolutely not a blow-by-blow history, and it's not a diplomatic history. So not quite military or diplomatic history, because these are frankly things that I was not very interested in, and many of them have been sort of written. And when people talk about 48, the images of the Ben Gurions and Amin al-Husseinis and others sort of come into mind, and they certainly take their due part in my story as well. But that was really not the center of what I was interested in. I was really interested in to see how mostly individuals, non-elites, what their sort of conception of the war, what they were doing, looked like. Both Jews who come from all over the world to fight in Palestine, of course, Palestinians, and Arab volunteers who also formed this volunteer army of the Arab League known as the Arab Liberation Army. Now, when I say that I'm set to look at these voices from below, first of all, it doesn't mean that the voices from above are excluded. They're definitely part of the story. And I look at this indoctrination and the propaganda that is produced both by the Zionist movement and the State of Israel, and also by the Arab Liberation Army and some organizations associated with it. So I look at these, and then I try to see how individuals sort of make sense of these larger sort of elite messages that they encounter. And when I try to see what sense they make of them, I really is very important to me to not give sort of a romanticized view, right? This is not a collection of letters of we see of the fallen, etc. And the way there's some of it in this for sure, but there's some also, a major focus on these identities in formation, but normal everyday's fear, bravery, failure, arrogance, cruelty, right? Unimaginable violence, lies, exaggerations, all that tapestry that story of the 1948 war. That's at least what I sought to do in Dear Palestine. We can talk about ways that happens or doesn't happen in our conversation.
Perfect. I think that's a great, short and to the point summary of the book and what it's about, why it's important, and what the purpose was of setting out in this endeavor. And let's just jump right into our discussion. So for the first question, I want to hand it off to Professor Myers.
Thank you, Avery. Really a delight to be with you, and thanks to the Nazarian Center for organizing this conversation on such a wonderful and important book. So Shay, my first question is twofold. First, what actually drew you to this topic? Did the sources find you, or did the underlying idea of this kind of study that we're going to unpack really draw you? And the second version of that question is, having been drawn to the topic, where would you situate yourself in the field of Israel studies? This is a symposium hosted by a Center for Israel Studies. So where do you place yourself on a map of the field? And I'm thinking in particular in relation to the new historians of the late 1980s. To what extent did they serve as a source of inspiration, as intellectual and scholarly foils? Where do you see your own work and that of your generation fitting onto that map?
Thank you so much, David. Yes, in some ways, these sources found me. I had a very different career. I was a radio and then a TV correspondent in Israel, covering the West Bank, the Israeli occupation, the Israeli military in the early 2000s, when I accidentally, literally by accident, stumbled on these letters. And we can talk a little bit about how this source was created, right, by this big brother NSA-like apparatus that spied on Israeli soldiers, on Palestinians, on many, many, many other groups to get their state of mind. And I remember, sitting in the Israeli archives, the IDF archives. It's a whole different institute, right? It's sort of a military compound, and finding this source by accident. One of the first letters that I actually read was by a soldier that was likely sent to blow up Palestinian houses, right? Empty Palestinian houses of Palestinians who were expelled or fled in 48. His letter was written in 1960, and he has this aha moment as he is writing a letter to his loved one, his family from that village. And he was like, it's always been told to us that we won over the Arab because we love this country more, because, they were not really attached to it. But now, as I am in this house, like the house that he was about to blow up, I see that this is sort of a manufactured narrative that has, and that people who lived here loved, and he actually uses these words, and he wonders where they are now, right? And I remember seeing that letter and many others that I've read and thinking, they really tell a story of 1948, of Israel, of this, right, place that is not familiar, that is unknown. And, I had a sense that this is a story that's worth telling. I had no idea how to do that, and, how to go about that. But, graduate studies and 10, 14 years later, here we are with this project. And in some ways, I did my undergraduate in Middle Eastern studies and were familiar with the work of the new historians. And my book also does, to a degree, some of those sort of myth busting, and we can talk about that, like the claim that the Arabs had planned to throw the Jews into the sea, etc. That something that I looked extensively in hundreds of Arabic sources and was not really able to find. But I did not set out to do that per se. I was really interested in writing a history, both humane and inhumane in some ways, but from the ground up. And in that sense, I think that my work, it has some similarities with the work of the new historians, but is not very similar. Perhaps the most similar is the work of Tom Segev, who was also very much attached to these, to engagement with these non-elites and the way they conceived of the world around them, what they were doing, why they were doing the things that we're doing. So that to answer the question on the new historians. Yeah.
Back to you, Avery.
Great. And then I think while we're on this topic of you, the historian, right, your position in this text, I want to ask how things have changed since the production of this book, since it actually came to light. So Dear Palestine came out almost exactly a year ago now. And in that time, a whole plethora of historians, including myself and Professor Myers, have either published podcast or book reviews of the book, not to mention that you yourself have done innumerable lectures, talks, roundtable discussions on the book. And my question is, in that year of time, after having gone through this whole reception process, what has surprised you most about how people have reacted to the book? And also perhaps what have you realized was an interesting thread in the book that maybe you didn't realize initially people would grab onto so much?
Yeah, I would say it was an interesting journey, and some had liked the book a lot, and others found it difficult, or sometimes were very angry at some of these narratives presented, or had a hard time to believe. Right? I mean, there's this letter that I often like by a female soldier that talks about this incredible violence and war crimes that she had seen in the war, including the burning of these Arab officers alive done by Jewish soldiers. And she writes, I never believed that Jewish soldiers from a good kosher home could do something like that, but the war had sort of changed my perspective, and had this whole internal external debate about what does violence in the context of Judaism may mean. And some people read that and had a difficult time with it. Others read that and felt that these are discussions worth having. The most interesting, I would say, is that I actually had a good number of people contact me from around the world, someone in Australia and in South Africa, etc., whose usually either parents or grandparents have fought in 1948, but were not, did not have that sort of celebrational approach to it. So, in the United States, there have been several films released on these volunteers, American Jewish volunteers who had come in 1948 and fought for Israel, and then remembered it as one of the most significant events in their lives. And the book looks at them as well. However, it also looks at those who were very disenchanted by what they saw, right? And felt very ambivalent about that. They may have generally seen themselves as Zionist and felt that, a Jewish state will be a safe haven for Jews. However, in the context of the expulsion of 3/4 of Palestine Arab population and other events during the war, also felt a very strong, sometimes really disenchantment, and sometimes they left Israel angrily. And when I was writing this book, I actually tried to find some of those and was unsuccessful. What is interesting is that with the publication of the book, I had several people write me and like, yeah, that's my grandfather's story. And, it was a chapter in his life that then ended, right? He decided to stay in South Africa or immigrate to Australia, or he remained here in the US or elsewhere, or he was a Moroccan Jew and ended up in France later, but he did fight in 1948. And, some of them had shared some of their personal stories with me, and sometimes asked for some more sources and send me pictures from those times and asked me to help them look at these pictures and sort out what is being captured there. And that was something I had not expected, and really was this amazing feeling. I have not yet succeeded in publishing a Hebrew version, although I hope one is coming in the next year or so. And I think this is a very important story and discussion, potentially also to allow Hebrew and also Arabic readers as well. And so my hope that will come true eventually as well.
Yeah, I have an interesting follow-up question on this reception. As we were talking about getting these letters from readers in Australia, South Africa, it came to my mind that another major theme in this book is geographical specificity, right? So leaders are targeting their messaging kind of in a very local dialect, I think is one of the terms that you're using, which is the messaging that they are sending to people from the United Kingdom is very different than the messaging that they're sending to people in Morocco. And my question about reception is, did you notice kind of geographical patterns in receptions to the book where American audiences might have focused on this aspect, Israeli audiences on another? And if so, kind of what were the differences in reception based on place?
Yeah, and I think that 48 is this really, I mean, it's pivotal moment in many ways, of course, the context of the Nakba, etc., no doubt about that, but it also brought all these very different groups of Jews, also of Arabs from around the world that I look at, and each of them, you know, were coming from somewhere, sometimes stayed in Israel, and then were sometimes going somewhere else, but coming to Palestine brought a lot of these questions. You know, Moroccan Jews are familiar with the anti-colonial struggle against the French in the Moroccan context. And some of these questions are brought to Palestine. And the Iraqi Muslim volunteers are familiar with the anti-colonial struggle against the British in Iraq, and they bring in that context. And the Holocaust survivors are familiar with that context, right? And many of them are taught and told explicitly in propaganda material is that there's another Holocaust that is going to happen in Palestine, right? That there's another extermination of the Jews that is going to happen there. And I talk about the merits of that as a historical claim, but that's a separate thing. And so they bring in these concerns and into their lives and stories and reflections from the war. And that also in some ways transformed into the way that the book was received. And so, you know, we saw certainly some reviews and stories that focus solely on the Moroccans. That's a fascinating story. And it's also my next research product, following these Moroccans all the way to 1959, a major anti-Ashkenazi revolt known as the Wadi Salib revolt. So that's a fascinating group, but you know, it's part of it. And you know, Al Jazeera published something and looked at the way that some of these air volunteers believed that when they're fighting the Zionists and the British in Palestine, they're also going to bring down those corrupt Arab regimes in their home country, right? The Shukri Kawutli and the Riyad al-Sulh and some of those others. And so, and they bring that with them to Palestine. And so while fighting in Palestine, they have these different sort of stories and agendas. And we see some of the Palestinian, both the Palestinian fighters that I look at and Palestinian civilians, and the really strong backlash against the Palestinian elite, right? And that is also something that has been captured in letters, and also some have been interested in it as a sort of a major issue dealt with in the book.
This is one of the really great things about the book, your reliance on letters and voices of both Jewish and Arab soldiers. This, I think, represents one of the key historiographical innovations. And I'm wondering, first, how do you imagine this coexistence of sources and the result of your narrative synthesis? Is this a comparative history? Is this a shared history? Is it a blended history? Is it an entangled history? How do you regard it in terms of your historiographical aspiration? It relates to my last question about where you situate yourself on the map of Israel studies scholars. Sort of what's the framing, the conceptual framing? And then, you know, if you can help us understand that, maybe you can sort of then push in to explain some of the parallelisms that you identify at the outset of your book when you talk about muscular Jews and muscular Arabs, and then you talk about a pan-Arab and a pan-Judaic sensibility or mobilization. And if you can get through that, I have some follow-up questions about that particular point, but this is a lot on the table for now. So yeah. First, how do you imagine this project of bringing together these voices? And then second, what are some of the operational categories that were of relevance, that sort of the way you could squeeze out of those letters this kind of comparative perspective?
That has been the most difficult task with this project. And, you know, I started with this as a doctoral dissertation, which was actually radically different than the book, and in which each ethnicity or group was separated into a chapter, right? So these Moroccan Jews and these Iraqi Muslims and these Syrian volunteers, and each of these was a chapter. And I did that in some ways on purpose, because I didn't want to present this, right, both-sidism, right? I'm not a writer for the New York Times, and I didn't feel that I need to balance this with this. And I had written this in that sense. And the editor at Stanford University Press, then, we started talking about this book, and she was like, this makes no sense. I mean, these Moroccan Jews, 70% of them want to go back to Morocco because of the racism they encountered in Israel in the context of the war, at the exact same point in time that that Palestinians are launching their grassroots attempt to return to Israel after the war. And this is happening at the exact same time. And literally some of these, the language is the same, not that the story is identical, but the story, and it makes no sense that these will be separated. And so I said, okay, well, let's rewrite this. That's why it took so long. And as is a sort of what I would call an integrated history, but without this both-sidism, right? I don't suggest that there's a balance here, right? And in this context, the analysis of Zionism as a settler colonial movement is important, or that one that hails also from settler colonialism is essential. But the parallels, as I started to rewrite this in an integrated manner, really jumped out literally of the page, including what you asked in the sort of tail end of your question, this idea of muscular or muscle Jews and muscle Arabs. And of course, those familiar with the history of Zionism would know how crucial was this idea of muscle Judaism or muscular Judaism, right, from figures like Nordau and Chelnichovsky and others, has been an important aspect of Zionism as it was conceived in the Eastern European context. And of course, that's not surprising. It's part of this larger milieu of Eastern European nationalism at the time. And that's a story I told, and that's a story that I always knew existed in the letters as well. But as I was sort of rewriting this as an integrated history, it also became apparent that you have a similar story in circles of Arab nationalism, including Palestinian nationalism specifically, no doubt, but also in forms like the Najada and El Futuwa and other scouting movements in Palestine, but also in Syrian nationalism and in Lebanese nationalism and Iraqi nationalism. And some of this mobilization for the Arab Liberation Army, I felt, also connected in ways to this attempt to put out this new muscular Arab figure that would, fight the global ring of colonialism. The British, the French would, restore Arab honor. It's not identical in the sense, it's not the same exactly, but it also has these important parallels where there's an attempt to sort of look back to some of the early Islamic history and find these typecast of non-impaired masculinity, which of course anyone who studies Zionism will be very, very, very familiar with. And as I was trying to write this in an integrated manner, that really sort of surfaced, and I realized that is something that's important, and it needs to be fleshed out without saying that there's a balance in power, but also pointing to some of the important parallels in these stories.
Yeah, so another one that I mentioned in my question was that between pan-Judaic and pan-Arab mobilizations or sensibilities. That is to say, the aspiration, at one level, this is a decidedly local conflict, but as you demonstrate, there are regional and even global dimensions to it within the respective combatant parties, not just sort of the wider colonial context to the conflict. And, the pan-Judaic mobilization extends as far, and this is a story that's known in the scholarship, but you shed new light on it, to displaced person camps in Europe. This becomes a site of pan-Judaic mobilization, and it might be helpful to our listeners and viewers to give a sense of what that looks like. And in parallel, as it were, what pan-Arab mobilization looks like. That is, say, beyond the specific theater of Palestine itself.
Yeah, and that part of the mobilization in DP camps was actually something that was difficult to write, and reading these sources was difficult. The Zionist movement and the Haganah specifically, and later the IDF, had put a lot of effort into the mobilization of Holocaust survivor in DP camps, in all sorts of well, I would say unsavory ways, but all sorts of ways, by sort of launching a campaign in those DP camps, all sorts of campaigns. One campaign saying that, you know, the extermination of Jews still goes on in Palestine, and so they have to not only immigrate to Palestine, but go there as soldiers, right, immediately after the end of World War II. And when that was only partially effective, they sort of ramped up that sort of rhetoric by saying, well, you know, actually, if you're a DP camp resident and you have shown any Zionist sympathies in the past, then we are now considering you as part of sort of the, not quite citizens, but subject to the conscription of all Jews in Palestine itself based on decrees of the National Assembly there. And there was actually an attempt to send these draft orders that we have today to DP camp residents, and say, you know, you have to enlist as a soldier and go fight in Palestine, or in Israel, I guess, at that point. And then the third sort of step of that was another sort of propaganda campaign, and trying to, I'm not sure I would call it shame, maybe, those who were reluctant to volunteer as soldiers. And we have this pamphlet that I look at, a transcript of not transcript, a sort of a play written called The Trial of a Dodger, where a quote unquote Dodger, a Holocaust survivor, is put on quote unquote trial because he refused to go and fight in Palestine after surviving the Holocaust, and is shamed because of that. And there's it's like a 40-page play written in Yiddish, and we don't exactly know whether it was distributed or performed, etc. And eventually this was very successful. It was a successful campaign of over 10,000 soldiers, not talking about any other form of immigration, 10,000 soldiers among the Holocaust survivors in DP camps that were mobilized, recruited, and ended up fighting in 1948. And what was most interesting about what I call this pan-Judaic movement is, and I guess it may not be such a clear point, there's such a sophisticated point, but it was very interesting to see how people were being mobilized, how Zionism can mean many things in many places, and for different people. And you know, obviously, if you sought this concept, if you did not see this idea of Jews, of a Jewish state at all enchanting, you may have been left out of that. But within those who responded to one degree or another, or engaged with that propaganda, what Zionism meant was so diverse, right, and so complicated. And in Morocco, it meant one thing, and in DP camps, it meant something else. In the United States, I look at the mobilization of American Jews, and it's interesting to see that the Zionist movement was very successful and very savvy in tapping into this idea of Jewish solidarity, right? Something that has been used for collecting donations for Jewish communities in need for hundreds of years. But here they tapped into this idea, but obviously for a very different purpose, to bring these Jewish soldiers into Palestine. Now, the situation in around the Arab world that I examine at length, I would say probably about half of the book, we haven't talked about it as much, but has a lot of parallels, but is also different. It doesn't have this centralized movement like the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel that, you know, can fund this. And so it's very different, very discrete. Some are using this pan-Arab mobilization platform to bring down corrupt Arab leaders in Syria and Iraq and others. Elsewhere, it's actually used to bolster these Arab leaders who sometimes are in cahoots with European forces, and sometimes Palestine and the mobilization for Palestine of fighters is actually used to help their position. And so it's much more sort of all over the place in terms of pan-Arabism. But of course, when you look at the letters, and that's something that I was really interested in, you see that some cite this idea, right, that all Arabs are brothers and sisters, etc. Some discuss Islamist ideas, including ideas such as jihad, and others are couching their fight in Palestine as a fight against global fascism and say that Zionism is a part of that movement. And so you really have this very diverse and again, all over the place conceptions of people, of what they're doing and why.
If I may, Avery, just to sort of jump in on the first part of the response, just one of the really curious features about the pan-Judaic mobilization, and you have a question in the Q&A that asks about obstacles to the resettlement of Jews as perhaps an added inducement to Zionist recruitment. But one of the very interesting features, sort of ideological dressings of that idea of Jewish solidarity, is the extension of extraterritorial sovereignty to DP camps. I'm thinking particularly of Nahum Shadmi, one of the sort of interesting second-tier characters, the Haganah activist, and this idea that displaced persons were citizens in potentia in DP camps, and as such, were not only welcome, but were in some sense subject to the mobilization into the fighting force of the newly created state of Israel. It's a kind of fantastic extension of an ideology at that point rooted in Palestine and the state of Israel back to Europe. I wonder if you want to just say a word about it.
Yeah, and you see, and here, I mean, they were really careful, the Zionist movement, later the state of Israel, of crafting these messages. And so you see the mobilization of American Jews, and thousands of them, a few thousand of them, 3,000 or so, end up fighting in Palestine. You see it's a version of this, but of course they do not dare saying something along the line of like, you are obligated to come fight for Jews elsewhere, right? So in DP camps it's done, but it's not done in the United States. And then in Morocco, you have something very different. You have this attempt to tap into those Alliance-educated Francophone Jews who are, of course, very familiar with the principles of the French Revolution and saying, you know, this is another fight for those who are seeking for freedom, etc. And that's why you need to come. And obviously the situation in Morocco plays a big role in this, and the rise of Moroccan nationalism and its complicated relationship with the Jews of the country. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that is quite surprising in some ways and very expensive. There was an attempt by the Zionist movement.
My next question is going to take us in slightly a different direction, and we've been talking around it kind of in the course of our conversation so far, but really one of the big takeaways of this book are the sources, right? The sources that you're using. And so one tremendous aspect of this that we'll talk about in just a moment is the censorship component. But before we talk about censorship, I have a question for you about materiality. And so I have this idea of walking into the Ministry of Defense or into the IDF archives, and I sit down and I want to look at the sources that you used. What is the archivist going to bring me? What kind of papers? How much of it is actually visible? What is the quality of the paper? How much is redacted? Just if you could walk us through, kind of paint a sensory, a tactile experience for the audience as what is it like to actually work with the source space that you used to make this book?
Yeah, so the IDF archives, where a lot of these sources are derived, and there are other archives and other collections, but that's one of the main ones, is in some ways a military compound. And for many years, you couldn't bring in your cell phone, and you're obviously subject to extensive security checks in the entrance. And that is, you know, there's many barriers for those who want to study these things, right? Many cannot enter Israel because of their political activism, etc. And we see that on a daily basis. But then those who can enter, including those Israeli citizens, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you may have more difficulties, not on the sort of formal level of it, but it will be much more challenging for you to engage in that world. And here was very helpful that I was a reporter covering the Israeli security establishment for about 7 years at that point. And I also had a very, very clear understanding of how it is built. And how it is structured, and also how it was structured historically. And also because I was a journalist, I had a harder time taking no for an answer. And so for the first 8 years, I was told that no, Palestinian letters were not being intercepted in that same censorship apparatus, this NSA apparatus, and that it doesn't exist. Sources like that did not exist. And I insisted that they do exist. And that either, I'm officially told that there cannot be declassified, and then I can seek legal remedy, or that they be declassified. And just as I was finishing my dissertation, literally the last week or something like that, I received some of these sources, and much of them remain still classified. Now, the IDF archives, it's because it is in many ways inaccessible, and in many ways, a lot of the material there is still, or the overwhelming, right, 97% of it is still classified, is often overlooked by scholars of Israel Palestine. And I get that. It is a very, very complicated structure to navigate, but it is also a structure that has sources sort of really beyond one's imagination. I mean, not only on so many aspects. I mean, the cultural heritage of Palestine and Palestinians is subsumed in many ways into that archives. Much of it has not seen the light of day, and I'm hoping that activists and scholars and others eventually compel the Israeli state to release that and to allow extensive access to that. So that's there too. But then, of course, or not, of course, I should say, you can't really access often the paper holdings, and so it's only scanned version that were already redacted, declassified, and sometimes redacted. And so that's challenges I've had throughout. And it's a complicated story because I've formed these close relationships, obviously, with a lot of these archivists and people that work there, right? They don't make the policies. The archive structure in Israel is very much controlled by the Shin Bet and the security establishment, in the sense that not only that they decide what gets declassified and what not, but even within what is declassified, they have sort of the last saying on, what would be redacted and what would not. And I've made that argument elsewhere, that a lot of these officials, sometimes ex-officials that are then after the retirement do that work, are very much concerned that narratives that challenge the stories that we're familiar with about the establishment of Israel, about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, about all sorts of these, about Mizrahi Ashkenazi relation, right? I had a Supreme Court case against the Shin Bet, specifically targeting those documents. They're very concerned that these new narratives will sort of explode in some ways, and that motivates a lot of their declassification. Now, it comes in periods of times. There was a period where you can get much more, and then with the ebb and flow of Israeli politics, some have changed. Now we're in this in-between era. There is a Supreme Court verdict from a few weeks ago that formally allows the Israeli military censorship that has to do with the unit that I use. We can talk about those sources in a second, but a formal military branch of the Israeli Intelligence Corps allows them a role in the declassification. So after the materials get declassified in Israel, and the Supreme Court has approved this, the military censorship will, quote unquote, take another stab at these sources and decide what can be revealed and what cannot. And I think that is actually a very, very upsetting and sad development. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and a follow-up on that, just another question I have about Israeli censorship in general. You touch on this in the book, but really, what is the genealogy of the censorship apparatus? So I know you mentioned in the book, it takes a lot from the British censorship apparatus. It was kind of inherited in that way. So I have a question, maybe one aspect of the question is to explain that, what the causal link or the kind of father to son link between the British Empire and the Zionist censorship apparatus was. But also if you would say that in the spirit of co-narration or integrated histories, if you can draw some sort of similarity, a cousin sort of similarity between the Israeli censorship apparatus and censorship apparatuses elsewhere in kind of authoritarian autocratic governments in the Arab world today?
Sure. Okay, so I should say what we're talking about when we talk about, because I guess not everyone is, they may be familiar with the term more generally, but major part of the book is derived from the archives of something called the Postal Censorship Bureau. And what that was this intelligence apparatus that was tasked with reading all letters going through Israel, both letters of soldiers, but also of civilians and also Palestinians under occupation and etc. Now, the formal reason for the existence, or the sort of the reason given, is that they needed to remove military secrets and redact them from letters, and that's something we've seen around the world, especially in wartime. But what they, I would say, probably was their main task, really, and was sort of hidden from plain sight, was to secretly copy these letters in order to send these intelligence reports about the state of mind, quote unquote, of these target populations. And so many of the sources I use look at obviously the writing of Jewish soldiers, but also the writing of Moroccan Jews, who were seen as a major risk and a problem in the Israeli context, because there was risk that they will overthrow Mapai, because they were living in large number, or at least intended to live in large number. And also, of course, letters of Palestinians, those Palestinians who were expelled in 48 and became refugees. Already in 49, they're exchanging letters with their families who became Israeli citizens. And a lot of these letters are being intercepted, copied, stored, and then reproduced as intelligence reports sent to Ben Gurion, etc. We're very interested to know what these target population thought of all sorts of developments. And these are sources I was very fortunate to have used in the book. And this is all British structure created during World War II. The postal censorship, the British postal censorship, was this very expensive apparatus spanning the entire world, with a major branch in Palestine, because it was a transit location of letters going from here to there. And the British are the ones who actually start that surveillance apparatus, sort of using letters to divulge the state of mind of population that they were interested in. We know the British do it in Palestine. The Americans, the US does it as well during World War II, as well as the Russians and the Germans and many, many others. This is a known thing. And when Israel is established and the British leave, there's about a lot of discussion of, how the British have in the late 30s and early 40s changed their mind about Zionism, and we see certainly Zionist militia groups starting to also target the British. But I think that sort of, if you take a few steps back, you see that the British were sort of grooming the Zionist and the Yishuv leadership to take over this country. And one of the things that they do, they literally hand the keys to that postal censorship apparatus and some other intelligence apparatus, etc. It helped that the person running this, or one of the most high-ranking, was a Jewish British official. And so he basically continues on, right? One day he works for the British, and literally in August of 48, then Ben Gurion appoints him as the chief censor of Israel, and that sort of continues. And that sort of course, idea of censorship and surveillance of population is very much with us. It's with us, of course, in the Arab world, and we know the resources that are put into this. But we also know from the revelations of Edward Snowden is that in some ways it's also with us in countries that we generally regard as democracies, including potentially here and elsewhere. And so that is something that the elites are very interested in, what the non-elites think, not in the sense that they would necessarily change their perspectives, right? It's much easier to monitor today with social media. But what was surprising to me in looking at these Israeli sources is that literally every topic that you would discuss today, from the Mizrahi Ashkenazi divide to the right of return, to all these things, were extensively discussed in these sources. And I think that's one of the things that drew me to them, because I was reading this and it sort of felt like discussion in in recent decades, right? Many times people would say, oh, breaking the silence in Israel, well, this is just a modernist, 21st century sort of narratives. But you actually see, not identical, but you see a trajectory of some of that writing going as early back as 1948, and of course with the Mizrahi-Ashkenazi divide as well.
So you've talked about sources, and it seems entirely intuitive that Israeli archives would contain, especially the postal censors, would contain letters from Israeli soldiers. What's interesting and surprising and perhaps counterintuitive is that same repository also contains a large number of letters from Arab soldiers. So I'm wondering if you could just, do two things. Tell us how that happened, that letters from Arab soldiers became part of the archival holdings of the State of Israel. What sort of implications or complications may result from that in terms of your reading? And then I think really the bigger question, which is, what do we learn from these letters? You offer some pretty surprising conclusions from a careful reading of these letters, and it seems like now's the time to share them with our readers, with our viewers.
Yeah, and so on the question of the Arab soldiers, so first of all, the letters of Palestinians, both civilians and fighters, some of it had gone through the Israeli postal censorship or had gone through the British postal censorship, but once the handoff of the keys ended up in the Israeli censorship, and many times Israel, when it conquered Palestinian villages, right, hundreds and hundreds of them in 1948, had confiscated the postal offices in those and had taken over the letters that were there, either being sent or received. And then another source had been compounds of the Arab Liberation Army that were raided by the Haganah and the IDF. Sometimes we actually know that letters were taken from dead bodies of soldiers. And these were letters in their original handwritten Arabic. And they were very, very challenging to first read and then decipher and then, make sense of. And I separate these stages. And I was very fortunate because the decade that I've studied Arabic was little help, and I was very fortunate to have worked with research assistant, an Iraqi research assistant who was very helpful in really making me both deciphering and helping me understand what is going on, what are they talking about? Because unfortunately, people do not include footnotes in their personal letters. I wish they did, but that often is not the case. And understanding these contexts of why these letters were written, especially for the Arab Liberation Army, was very challenging. And I was very fortunate to have the assistance of many, many people who've done me favors of all sorts in looking at those. And then in terms of the conclusions, there's all sorts of complicated stories there. They do come together, but they're also separated. If we look at the Jewish side for a second, we see that the most significant dissent was among these who, quote unquote, had some alternative. That's an important thing to mention, right? So Moroccan Jews, right? Their letters were being intercepted. There was these statistics that were sort of composed and collected by the Postal Censorship Bureau, and they've shown that 70% of Moroccan Jews who ended up fighting for Israel in 48, and 60% of the general Moroccan population in Israel wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco at the conclusion of the war because of what they described as Ashkenazi racism against them. And that plays a major role in the war. And that's one group. And the other group are mostly disenchanted foreign American or other Western Jewish volunteers that had the option of going back to the United States or South Africa. And so while we see dissent in all sorts of places, and some Sabra Jews, right, Jews that were born in Israel, sometimes initially show dissent, but oftentimes eventually are saying, okay, well, I guess that's what, Judaism in the national era means. And we should be like soldiers of all other nations, right? Where violence is a major component of national liberation, and we should enjoy it or take pleasure in this. And we see that. But we see dissent in an actual, what's called an exit, right? An attempt to distance yourself from this, from whatever that is that was created at the end of the 48 war, that we only see, or mostly see, I should say, in those group of either Moroccan Jews or American Jews who sometimes, they speak very harshly at what they saw and then seek to actually leave Israel and go somewhere else. Sometimes they still want to keep Israel as a refuge in case things go wrong, right? So we don't always see a complete attempt to disassociate. And so that is a complicated story there. And then, of course, what we see in the letters of Palestinians that I also follow in the book is this sort of emergence of somewhat of an anti-elite sentiment. We saw some of it in the 36 revolt in Palestine. It grows in 1948. Many feel that both Palestinian and Arab elites had failed them among the Palestinians, and they talk a little bit about how and why that happens. And they eventually launch these grassroots campaigns attempting to return to Palestine, or to now what had become Israel, including by stating, yes, we want to go back, we want to live under Israeli rule, that's fine, and we often see that the elites may not be as much significant part of that campaign of return. And the reason we know about that is, of course, because these are intercepted letters, and oftentimes the exchange of letters between Palestinians who became refugees in 48 and their families who became Israeli citizens, discussing how they're going to smuggle the border into Israel, that has obviously also been intercepted by the Postal Censorship Bureau, who we know transfer that information to the Israeli border police, who often ambush these people trying to return, either expel them again and even kill them. We have up to 5,000 Palestinian civilians that are killed after the formal conclusion of the war in 1949, all the way to 1956. And so that is also one of the legacies of this story of this war.
We've really only scratched the surface of the discussion that we should have about this book, but unfortunately we do have to move on. Well, not unfortunately, but we must move on to the Q&A. And so I've pulled two great questions from the audience for us to go over for the conclusion of our program today. This first of these questions is a comparison of sources. So an anonymous person asks, how does the availability, quality, and quantity of the Arab sources compare to that of the Jewish and Israeli sources? So you've kind of talked about both separately, but if I had to sit them down and kind of draw a Venn diagram, how would you say these are similar and how are they different?
Yeah, and that, I initially found these letters of Israeli soldiers, and obviously there's endless materials for sort of Zionist propaganda of those years, etc. But it was really, I really wanted to locate these, or what I felt or hope would be equivalent sources for both Palestinians and some of the Arab states who participated in 48. That has been very, very challenging to do. I was able to amass a large body of sources, no doubt, probably several thousands of pages of these sources, but they do not compare in their structure and in many ways to the sources, either the Israeli sources or largely sources produced by the Zionist movement. And of course, there's all sorts of levels to this, right? The literacy rate among Jews was much higher than the literacy rate among both Palestinians and these Arab volunteers. And so you have many more soldiers that are writing. Now, here you also have these Arab scribes that are often writing letters on behalf of these Arab volunteers. And that's something that I was able to discuss and use, but it's different, right? The writing in Arabic, either in colloquial Arabic or even in standard Arabic, is in some ways more formulaic, at least at that period of time, and that has changed. And we don't need to go into the convictions of Arabic writing, but there are certainly some significant differences in terms of sources. Well, I was again very fortunate to get the help of colleagues who had dug up for me, sources in the Iraqi National Library and in the Lebanese National Library, because there was all these small associations, many of them not many have heard of, that work to mobilize Arab volunteers somewhere, right? In Libya, in Saudi, in 1948. And I was very fortunate to get some of these sources, and I really feel unreached this project. And so while certainly far from being perfect, that's the best I could do.
Right, and then the next question comes from a friend of mine, a fellow PhD student here at UCLA in the Conflict Department, Sharon Zelnick, who asked about changes in language over time. So she wants to know how you dealt with changes in propaganda language from the 1940s through to today, and also how language changed against geographic context. So what is, the difference between propaganda language in DP camps in Europe and propaganda language in, say, Morocco? I'm also curious about the forms of the letters themselves, and if any of the letters were postcards with images.
Yeah, so language has been a fascinating topic. I've not had the opportunity to write about it much. It's interesting that the Postal Censorship Bureau was also really interested in it, because it was assumed to be a part of the Nationalist Project. So, that censorship existed from 48 all the way to 2004. And what they do is they track over time how languages change, how many more people use Hebrew, what happens to the Arabic usage among Jews and things like that. And they actually have these cool statistics that I have not included in the book, but that's something that certainly you see. I mean, and in the Arab volunteers, you see some still writing in Ottoman Turkish, right? In Arabic alphabet, but in Ottoman Turkish, right? Supposedly defunct sort of language by that point, but obviously not really. I'm sorry for all the Ottomist friends who may be listening in, but so language is important, is a major component, and it's also important in propaganda, right? In DP camps, the propaganda is often in Yiddish, in Morocco, in French, with some Judeo-Arabic or Arabic, and obviously in the United States in English, etc. In the Arab world, you see some attempts to create, colloquial sort of mobilization, and I look a little bit at that. I have to say that is something that I should have probably looked at more. And then there's the question of translation. A lot of these Postal Censorship Bureau reports do not include the original letters, but copies of them, or not really copies, but excerpts of them that are sometimes translated. Sometimes you know what the original language was, and sometimes it is not written. And so that is another challenge of using that to actually say something significant about the person writing, and that's a struggle the challenge I've struggled with throughout writing.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, friends, I think our time has come mostly to an end here for this event, but I want to say thanks to both of you for this delightful discussion. It's always great to be with both of you and to discuss history, which we all love so much to do. I want to thank the audience for their participation, also for their wonderful questions. I want to thank the Nazarian Center and also the co-sponsors for helping us put on this event. And I want to also mark to the audience that I invite you to join the Nazarian Center's upcoming event, a webinar tomorrow on May 5th on the religious significance of the State of Israel with UCLA's own Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. And thanks again so much for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Myers, Professor Hazkani. Everyone, be well, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Avery. Thank you, Shay.